Attention, Canadians. Do you feel disconnected from our current political system? This could be our last chance to take a real legal stand for our rights. It's time to shift the political power to its rightful owners, the Canadian citizens and Indigenous peoples of Canada. Dive into our history, understand the need for change, and embark on the quest for true democracy. Are you concerned about our nation's commitment to human rights and self-governance? The power shift to freedom aligns with vital treaties and international laws enabling us to claim our rightful place as collective head of state. We advocate legally replacing the Crown, King Charles III, and our partocracy system with a true democracy, the peoples as the true collective head of state with veto power over our governance, to ensure your voice counts more than party interests. When our national collective civil and political rights are respected, your influence on policies will be direct and impactful. Join us on this noble struggle to make every Canadian and Indigenous peoples a meaningful participant in our future as collective head of state, which was legally owed and kept from us since the patriation of our Constitution, an official decolonization from the United Kingdom of 1982. It's time to correct the past of our government's lies and omissions to the people of our great country before it is too late. People 15 years old and over can sign our Canadian People's Referendum at canadianreferendum.ca and unite for our rights as the collective head of state in our Constitution. Together, we can be the example in reshaping Canada's future, not just for us, but for all peoples worldwide, once and for all. Are you ready to be part of this transformative movement? Join the Power Shift to Freedom movement by the Canadian People's Union and be part of a bold vision for Canada's future. Visit thecpu.ca for more details. Embrace and face the change required on your part to shape our future.
Good afternoon. After very strongly renaming the Gulf of Mexico as Gulf of America, we will be making further changes effective immediately. Europe will now be known as America Plaza East. The Panama Canal will be known as Trump America Canal of Trump. And of course, Turkey will now be known as Chicken.
Why are you renaming Turkey in particular?
Why are we doing it? Because we can. What are they going to do about it? Does Turkey want a beef over being called chicken? We'll call them beef. What else? Oh, also we're going to name Hungary Thirsty. But don't worry, the Prime Minister there will do whatever I tell him.
What is behind this policy of changing everyone's name?
Because America will no longer allow people to tell us what to call them. It's like the pronouns. It's over. So what's that? Zelensky's on line 3? Put him on speaker. What else do you want? We're cutting off the aid immediately. Mr. Trump, we demand that you call our country Trump Crane. Trump Crane? Boy, I always thought of it more of a me crane than a Ukraine, but tell me more. Greater Trump Crane. Greatest Trump Crane. Deal, and we will also rename Donbass Donald Bass and retake from Russia. Deal, I love it. Sally, tell Pete Hegseth to give these Trump Cranians whatever they want. Public regime. Hello?
Donald.
Oh, hello, Vladimir. How's it going in Russia?
Good, good. Hey, listen, I've been looking at some stuff you've been saying lately.
Did you see the video of me talking with Obama at the Carter funeral?
Hilarious, Donald, and I love funerals. But, you know, some of other things, like about Panama Canal and Greenland and...
I can't believe we ever gave the canal away. What a very sad and weak move.
Well, tell me about it. It's how I feel about Khrushchev and Crimea.
Yeah, whatever. Did you see Greenland wants to be part of the United States? It's like the Eastern Ukrainians or whatever.
Ha, yeah, see, that's kind of point. I mean, it's...
What's the problem?
Well, I mean, it's just... You're stealing my material. Invading neighboring countries just because you can. That's my thing.
Oh, is it now?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Well, what are you gonna do about it?
You leave me no option. I am now backing Canada.
You're what?
Canada. I'm backing it. We will now call it Crusher.
Well, I'm gonna call it Canada.
Canada? What's Canada? That's not even a mix of USA and Canada. What are you...
Well, I'm gonna say it. Big, beautiful Canada. Canada.
Crusher.
Canada.
Crusher.
Wait. Shouldn't we ask the Canadians what they think about all of this?
You really got me. You really got me.
Yeah, well, I don't really believe that we should get too much into the politics of another country. So I'm not crazy about Elon Musk intervening, let's say, in the German election right now, in a pretty visible way, especially because I call him kind of our prime minister. Actually, he's so influential in the new Trump administration that his intervention in German politics right now carries a lot of weight. He's not only the richest person in the world, not only sending spaceships up, not only building all sorts of amazing things, by the way, but he's politically very powerful right now. So I know him. We have a friendly relationship, but I haven't talked to him about this. I don't really know what he has in mind on this. My general advice is let the elections go on among the German people and the German voters, and don't intervene.
So are you scared of his influence, or are you looking positive about it?
Well, it's a very weird time in general in the world, but in the United States, at the inauguration, I think there were 10 tech giants with a combined net worth of $2 trillion or something absolutely ridiculous. Yeah, that's not healthy for society, actually. What happened in the United States is we really became a plutocracy. Over the last 40 years, our Supreme Court, which oversaw decisions about our election law, kept eliminating any limits on giving by corporations or by the super rich. And the Supreme Court made a really stupid argument, in my view. They said, well, this is just free speech, and it won't corrupt politics. Are you kidding? If you have billionaires that are giving huge amounts of money to politicians, you don't think that that corrupts politics? Of course it does. So the U.S. political system became deeply corrupt, but in its genius, in quotation marks, it's all legal. It's not illegal corruption. It's legal corruption. But it made the U.S. a plutocracy, meaning for both political parties, the main parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, they both look to their billionaire donors for what they're going to do. And, most of us are not billionaires. And we're looking at this and saying, this is how government is now. It's not good. You asked, am I worried about it? Very worried about it.
So thank you very much, Jeffrey Sachs, for this answer. And just to explain you, we have more than one student here. We have altogether, I think, 6 or 7. So they're going to swap seats. And now we have the next student here. What's your name?
Mika.
Okay, Mika, you also brought a question for Jeffrey Sachs for this discussion. What do you want to know?
All right. Hello, Mr. Sachs. So I wanted to know, during your time as a UN advisor, what were like examples of advices that you gave that you feel very proud of looking back, but also the other way around? So what are advices that you gave or misconceptions that you made that you feel when you look back that you probably shouldn't have given?
Yeah. When you're in the activity of giving advice, there's one thing that is a basic thing that most of the time you're ignored. So it's a very interesting activity because sometimes you get listened to, often you get ignored. And probably I've had some good luck with being heard and being proud of the outcome. I spent a lot of time on the 2 big development goals of the UN during the last 25 years, the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I helped work on both of them with the Secretary General of the UN. So I'm very proud of that work. And one thing that I'm especially proud of is trying to solve a particular problem in a practical way, an issue that 20 years ago was very urgent, was that 3 big diseases at the time, malaria, TB, and HIV/AIDS, were just running completely out of control. And I made a recommendation to establish a new global fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. And Kofi Annan thought that was a splendid idea, and he was a genius as a diplomat, and he convinced George Bush, the president at the time, to adopt the idea, and suddenly this thing became real, and it has saved, by one count, tens of millions of lives. So I'm very, very proud of that. A lot of time I'm frustrated in terms of what I got wrong. Gosh, I have to think about that. It's the main thing you want when you're trying to solve problems is actually for something to happen. So when something doesn't happen, maybe in all of those occasions you ask, could I have been more practical? Could I have done something politically better? Is there something that I missed? So that kind of feeling, that's pretty much on a lot of issues that I've worked on. And I look back and I say, yeah, I didn't really understand the politics that was at play exactly right. And so I thought something was going to happen, but it didn't happen. So that's pretty much goes with the territory.
Do you have anything like concrete where you felt the way you just described? Just a concrete situation?
You know, one of the things that I spent a lot of time working on that is very real issue now, that I've also spent a lot of time reflecting on, is what happened with the period of Russia's reforms in the early 1990s, because I was very much involved with those when President Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to make reforms in the early 1990s before the end of the Soviet Union. I worked with his economic team, And then when the Soviet Union ended and Russia and the other countries became independent, I worked with Boris Yeltsin's economic team. And it was a very difficult period. And most of what I advised was completely ignored. But one thing in particular that was a very major part of my advice was I was trying to get Europe and the United States interested in helping the Soviet Union and then helping Russia financially. And it didn't work. They weren't interested. And I never understood at that time, 30 years ago, why wouldn't you help? 30 years later, I understand a lot better. My government, the US government, was really nasty. It still viewed Russia as an enemy, even back in the early 1990s when Russia was a new independent country wanting to be a democracy, wanting to be part of partnership with Europe and the US. And the US still viewed Russia as an enemy. So that's a period that I think about a lot because a lot went wrong in those years that shouldn't have gone wrong. And it cast a shadow for a long time afterwards. And we have a war now, which was unimaginable 30 years ago, by the way, because the entire mood in Russia was, we want peace, we want friendship. And I think the United States never really wanted that or understood the opportunity. So that was a period that I think a lot about.
Thank you very much. And while we swapped the chair on my left side to the next student, I would like to show the audience what book we have here. This is also a reason why Jeffrey Sachs is here at Western Verlag. It's called, in German, Diplomatie oder Desaster. Zeitenwende in den USA, ist Frieden möglich? Which is translated, I do that kind of freestyle now, diplomacy or disaster. A big change of time in the US, is peace possible? This is the subtitle of this very great book, and I really recommend it. Everybody who speaks German should really have a look in this book. So
I recommend it too because of one thing. We have to learn diplomacy again.
And that's
the whole point of this book, which is talk to each other. Not just make armaments, make war, we have to escalate, they're evil, but talk to each other. And we forgot that.
And maybe we have some future diplomats sitting here asking questions to a great US economist. So what's your name? And maybe you also say one little sentence about the school that you're from, because we haven't talked about that yet, the Filipinum, maybe just the place and maybe around how many students there are in your class.
My name is Nicholas. I'm from the Gymnasium Filipinum, as we will call it in German. Our school has roundabout, I would say, 1,000 students. And in our German class, from which we are here, we are about, let's say, 25 or 26 students. And we have this partnership with this place here, with the Verlag, I don't know the name.
Publishing company.
Publishing company, West End. And we are thankful for the opportunity to speak to you, Mr. Sachs.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. I want to ask you about a recent comment former President Joe Biden made in his farewell speech. In his speech, he warned the American public about the emergence of a new tech oligarchy in the United States. What is your opinion about this comment?
Yeah, it's one of the few sensible things Joe Biden said during his presidency. And it's a shame that it takes the farewell speech to say something sensible. By the way, it's interesting. The most famous, well, there are two famous farewell speeches in American history. One is George Washington's farewell speech, and he warned America against foreign entanglements. So he said, stay out of European politics, too complicated, too many wars. we should just stand clear.
When was this? Excuse me?
That would have been probably 1796.
Incredible.
If I remember correctly.
He was really like prophetic a little bit.
Yes. Well, he was our first president, and he was a good one. Then the other really famous farewell speech was on January 17th, 1961, which was the speech of Dwight Eisenhower. And he warned against what he called the military-industrial complex. So that's the predecessor to Biden's warning. Again, what's interesting about Eisenhower is he was a general, of course. Then he became president in 1952. And he presided over the growth of the military-industrial complex. And then with 3 days left in his term, he warned us about it. And so maybe he could have warned us about it earlier, but he had a very, I think, unlikable, unskilled, or how should I put it, nasty foreign secretary, essentially, who was our Secretary of State, named John Foster Dulles, who was an ardent anti-communist who built up a lot of the military-industrial complex and during Eisenhower's period. And then Eisenhower gave the warning, and Eisenhower's warning was very important. It's true. I quote it all the time. Americans quote it all the time. Now, Biden is saying we have a military technology complex and these mega powerful elites. We all know one of them, Elon Musk, who is really rich and really powerful and an engineering genius, but now sitting at the center of power and worth about $450 billion today as a person. So this is something dangerous for society, that there's so much power concentrated in such few hands. Did Biden do much to address this during his presidency? Not at all. Biden wasted his presidency. He wasted his presidency on war, which I give him a lot of blame for, both Ukraine and in the Middle East, the war in Gaza of Israel, instead of diplomacy, because in my opinion, both wars could have been ended at the negotiating table quickly, and should have been, rather than with so much violence and so much killing continuing to this day. And because the wars continued, it raised the power of these elites. Because if you look at our tech industry, of course it's doing many amazing technological advances, no doubt, but it's also very deeply tied to the Pentagon. These are big contracts going from the Pentagon to Meta, or going from the Pentagon to Amazon Cloud Services, or to Microsoft. They're all intermeshed. And so this is a kind of military tech complex with a lot of very powerful people, a lot of money in the U.S. political system. And the American people are kind of spectators watching this amazing spectacle, and not, I think for a lot of Americans, they don't feel that the political system really responds to them at all. So even if they support Trump and, are happy that he got elected, most people feel that the politicians are off in their own game and not really listening to the public.
In my opinion, he made a good choice by appointing Lina Khan as the FTC chairwoman. Would you agree with this opinion? And what else, in your opinion, should he have done to mitigate the damage that has been done by the oligarchy, or to maybe reverse the trend of a growing oligarchy in the United States?
Yeah, there are two big issues with the plutocracy, with the government by money. First is the more the U.S. government is like an imperium, the more it is a military state, the more out of control the government is. And the U.S. government, in my view, is to a very significant extent a war state. The U.S. is at war all the time. It's at war in Ukraine. It's at war in the Middle East. Of course, maybe it's not American soldiers, but believe me, it's American missiles, it's American financing, it's American intelligence, it's a lot of American personnel on the ground, even though maybe not in uniform. So these are, to an important extent, American wars. When you're perpetually at war, the government is secret, things are confidential, there's no public oversight over war policy, and so you lose the fiber of democracy. You lose even the habit of democracy. They don't ask our opinion. One day we read, okay, Biden approved firing missiles deep into Russia. This was a couple of months ago. This was after many months where the Pentagon said, no, that's too dangerous. That could lead to a big escalation and so forth. And then the reverse decision was made. When it was made, there was no consultation in our Congress, like the Bundestag, but the U.S. Congress, none at all. There was no public debate. There was no explanation. There was no speech by the president. We don't even know whether Biden could give such a speech exactly right now because he's not in such great shape. But in any event, it was a decision completely of a kind of war cabinet, or not even cabinet, of somebody. I don't know if Jake Sullivan signed it or Lloyd Austin, our Secretary of Defense, or we don't know where these decisions come from, but they don't come democratically. So this is one risk that I feel. And of course, in Roman history, as I'm sure you've all studied at length, there was a republic and it became an empire. And the senators still walked around in their togas, but they had no power afterwards. And that, I feel, has essentially happened to the United States, that we went from a republic to an empire, and I don't like it. It has meant perpetual war and a loss of accountability. The second thing that happened, I mentioned, is more and more money in our politics. And the wealthy have become so wealthy, it's unimaginable. I mean, who dreamt that one person would have $450 billion of net worth? You can get by just with $1 billion, by the way. You know, you don't need $450 billion. But we have many, I had to even look up the word, I didn't realize it's now in common use, centibillionaires, meaning that you have $100 billion or more. We have many of them now. Come on. They could pay some taxes. They could help solve some social problems more, and so on. And this tendency is still continuing. And that, of course, dramatically diminishes the sense of rule of law institutions and democratic institutions. I don't know if you've studied Aristotle and the Politics, but that's, to my mind, the best book of political science ever written, and it was written 2,300 years ago. And he said, don't allow the inequality to become so big because your government, your society won't function. And that's what's happening to the U.S. right now.
Netanyahu has been the most destructive
U.S. president we ever had, because he's told every president what to do. Every president has completely supported Netanyahu's vision of remaking the Middle East until today. And by the way, with Israel's illegal grab and effective invasion of territory, I mean, not effective, invasion of Syria in the last few days, the U.S. statesman said, well, yes, so we regard this as an understandable provisional action of the United States, of Israel, and the United States supports this. Of course, the United States supports this. The United States supports whatever Israel does, however much chaos is created out of all of this. What we're seeing in the last days is part of a plan that goes back more than 20 years. It sounds zany, but this is craziness that we're dealing with. This is a plan for taking out 7 regimes. So they thought legally, literally, I mean, you do something completely lawless, initiating war, but you look for a legal fig leaf. And that was why Iraq first. But the idea was that Syria would be overthrown immediately afterwards. And then immediately after that would be the rest of the list. And what has been explained to me by military individuals that were in the midst of this is that the U.S. military got tied down in Iraq in an unexpected way with the insurgency. So they didn't move straight to take out Assad, which was supposed to happen in 2003. So this is quite interesting. But why do this? And Netanyahu spelled this out in his book in 1996, Fighting Terrorism, and then in a rather remarkable speech that he gave in the United States on September 20th, 2001, just after 9/11. He said, you don't fight terrorists by fighting the terrorists. You fight terrorists by fighting the states that support them. And Netanyahu's idea, backed by the crazy, violent, repulsive neocons, I hope I'm being clear, in the U.S. government, said, yes, we will remake the Middle East by war, one after another. So Hamas and Hezbollah are backed by Saddam Hussein. They're backed by Assad. They're backed by Iran. In fact, it wasn't just the Iranian axis of resistance back then. It was all of these states around Israel that were supporting the Palestinian cause. And if you think about it, of course, Iraq was 2003. The war on Assad started in 2011. Not everyone is aware of Operation Timber Sycamore, but this is the CIA operation to overthrow Assad under Obama. And everyone should understand, doesn't matter, Democrats, Republicans, nice people, not nice people. America has one foreign policy of continuity, and it has nothing to do with Democrats and Republicans. So Assad was 2011, the war started, but they didn't succeed in overthrowing Assad because he had backing from Russia, which started especially in 2015. Hezbollah was the backstop of the Syrian regime. And the idea was, of course, by attacking Hezbollah in Lebanon and drawing Hezbollah forces into Lebanon and blocking the resupply of Hezbollah through the active bombing of Syria in recent weeks and through this military action. This was the way to bring down the regime. It happened, I'm sure, much faster than anybody anticipated. Now Israel is invading Syria from the southwest into the northeast. Where it stops, who knows? There are crazy people in Israel who say, go on to Damascus. Then if you go down the rest of the list, Somalia, well, that was attacked by a U.S. proxy by Ethiopia in 2006. Sudan, the United States broke Sudan into pieces, it literally dividing it into Sudan and South Sudan, with the clever ploy of the United States to put all the oil reserves in South Sudan, not in North Sudan, which is now bankrupt and in starvation and in civil war. Libya in 2011. Lebanon, of course, invaded repeatedly by Israel, including just recently. So actually, this vision has been carried out. And this is what Netanyahu was crowing about a couple of days. We have remade the Middle East. We've done it step by step. So we should have no doubt that this is part of a long-term strategy. Of course, there are cameo appearances by Erdogan. He wants Turkish influence in Syria. This definitely plays a role. I don't mean to minimize that. But this is part of a long-standing plan. And the immediate collapse, which none of us saw coming, I don't know anyone that saw this except, I suppose, inside the Israeli intelligence community and no doubt CIA and a few others, in the interpretation of the people running Israel and the United States. If the other side says negotiate, that means they are weak, and you should start by assassinating literally the negotiators, because it's very important to kill people who would negotiate in the Netanyahu neocon vision, and then you go to war against them. They're weak. This is the madness that we're in right now. What will come out of this? Nothing good. Absolutely nothing good. If you look at the killing fields and the chaos that Israel and the United States have sown throughout the Middle East since the Iraq War, it's stunning that there has not been one moment of political solution, not one moment of peace, not one resolution of one crisis. So to my mind, this whole approach is madness. And if you were to have read Netanyahu or known Netanyahu back 30 years, it was madness then, and it's madness today. The idea that the jihadist groups that the United States has backed, and of course everybody does understand, I'm sure, listening in, that Al-Qaeda is a U.S. creation, was and always has been and continues to be. So all these, quote, terrorist groups, yes, they're on CIA backing from the start. It's not even, of course, not even a secret. It's thoroughly documented in shelffuls of books. You don't get peace out of this. You don't get a safe border because we've brought down the evil Assad regime. You get ongoing war and chaos, and that's already, but that's not going to sit well. That's not a stable environment. Netanyahu already said, this is ours. We're going to claim this. We're never giving this up. This is Israel's whole approach. Whatever we take is ours. And it's up to us to decide what we take more. This is the greater Israel approach. It's completely destabilizing. It's madness. So, of course, there could be war between Turkish-backed forces and the United States. There could be easily war between Turkish-backed forces and Israel. That would bring a wider war. There could be a new war with Iran. We don't have clarity on this. The Israel lobby in the United States has been so dominant and so reckless, and Netanyahu is absolutely so profoundly irresponsible, and his government is perhaps even worse than Netanyahu, though that's a little hard to say. But this is a completely extremist government that is absolutely aiming for a wider war. Everything is possible right now in the Middle East. Israel wants wider war. It wants to pull Trump into a wider war. There will be people in his government that want a wider war. There will be people that oppose it. And Netanyahu definitely is angling for a wider war. So, unfortunately, in our world, the decisions of a few people shape the fates of tens or hundreds of millions of people, or even billions of people. And that's the situation that we're in right now. Nobody gets to vote on this. This is a decision of a few people, and they do not behave well very often. Obvious. We are one vote away from a solution that would bring peace to the Middle East. And that one vote is the veto that the United States imposed on having a state of Palestine as a sovereign state alongside Israel on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967, according to international law. The United States has vetoed this on behalf of Israel. This, to my mind, is the root of the conflicts throughout the region. The Netanyahu doctrine is there will never be a Palestinian state. And because of that, there will be resistance to Israel. And because of that, Israel must be at war with every government in the region that supports the Palestinian cause. And this goes back 30 years. And Israel has provoked wars all over the region to try to replace regimes that are behind Palestine and behind Hamas and Hezbollah, who fight for Palestine. And so rather than having peace, we have war. And the United States has gone to war on Israel's behalf repeatedly, to the great detriment of the world, to the great detriment of the United States, and to the great detriment, in my view, of Israel's long-term security as well. This is the basic choice. Do we have peace or do we have expanding war? And the hold of the Israel lobby on American politics has been so strong that the choice has been expanding war in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Sudan, in Somalia, in Libya, and if Netanyahu gets his way, in Iran. We have a remarkable statement by General Wesley Clark that is very well known, that after the 9/11 attack, Wesley Clark visited the Pentagon and he was shown a piece of paper that said 7 countries would be overthrown in 5 years. And the list was Iraq, Syria, Iran, Lebanon, Somalia, Sudan, and Libya. And Clark expressed befuddlement and bewilderment. What does this have to do with 9/11? And the answer was, we're making the Middle East over again. This was the clean break strategy from 1996, now to be implemented. And in September 2001, though Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, the decision was made immediately that to implement this remake of the Middle East, the first invasion would be of Iraq. This by itself is interesting, just as a footnote. The reason that they chose Iraq first was not because of Saddam or weapons of mass destruction, which they knew did not exist, but rather there was a legal fiction that they could use, a 1998 Iraq Liberation Act, which had been passed by Congress and signed by President Clinton, that made it the law of the land that Saddam Hussein should be removed from power. I think that there are strong reasons that go beyond Syria for the rapprochement of Iran and Saudi Arabia, not the least of which is that each of these two countries actually wants normalcy and economic development. They actually do not want ongoing war. I think Israel and the United States are the main provocateurs in the region. And I think the failure of the diplomacy to establish peace through a state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel is strangely enough, even though that's just one corner of the Middle East, it's the remaining dominant factor for the continued war. And the reason is that Israel remains on a rampage throughout the region, in Lebanon, in Syria, in wanting war with Iran. The immediate determination, it seems, to annex the West Bank. In all of this, Israel is a great destabilizer. And as long as the United States steadfastly backs that destabilization, there cannot be peace in the region. But there is a common interest of Iran and Saudi Arabia in not having this spill into a generalized regional war. And this is the direction it will head if there is a breakdown in that new rapprochement, or if the United States continues to back Israel in its, I think, utterly reckless and destructive vision of the greater Israel, so-called. I think Syria will continue to be a killing field. It will continue to be a battleground. I don't believe myself that there's likely to be any kind of unified Syria in the coming years. Israel has invaded in the south. The United States backs Kurds in the northeast. Turkey has supported the jihadists, not only in the most recent action to take Damascus, but to enter into battle with the Kurdish forces. Iran has strong interests and is not going away. The idea that this is somehow in any way likely to be settled strikes me as very, very over-optimistic. All of the experience of Western regime change, and this is another Western regime change. Maybe the coup de grace was brought by Turkey, though I'm not even convinced of that entirely, because it was Israel and the United States that played a very large role in the events of bringing down Assad over the past 13 years. But all of the experiences that in events like this, things don't end with the fall of a regime. This typically is the beginning of new civil war. And I think that this is likely in the Syrian context. Now, let me state at the outset, I think Netanyahu is a madman. I think what Israel has done is destructive beyond belief. But the point is that there has been a plan. The plan has been to remake the Middle East in Israel's image, if you will. And already back in 1996, in a neocon paper written for the new Israeli prime minister at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, called Clean Break, this was described. The clean break was a clean break of the Middle East, that Israel, of course, meaning the United States, military backing Israel, would take out Israel's enemies. And this has been an operational plan, strangely enough, at least since 9/11. I think the interesting starting point is a statement by Netanyahu a couple of days ago. He gave a press conference. He said that this is a completion of a step-by-step process that Israel has been pursuing. And I think that that is not bragging, if I could put it in that odd way. I think that that is an accurate statement of what has happened. but it's not only an Israeli effort of the last few months with its war on Hamas and Hezbollah, which dramatically weakened the military base of the Assad government, which depended on Hezbollah for its military backing. But this is a campaign of Israel, as Netanyahu himself said, that is to remake the Middle East that goes back 30 years, actually. And I just say this because, of course, no one mentions what this has to do with the people of Syria at all, except that we see for one day the happy talk of those flags waving in Damascus, like we saw the flags waving in Baghdad, like we saw the flags waving in Mogadishu, like we saw the flags waving in Khartoum, blah, 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 blah. We know that this is the prelude to yet more bloodshed. Nobody in the United States government, certainly not in the Israeli government, certainly not in the British government. I regard those as the three worst, by the way, but there are others that might challenge them, but I regard those as the three worst. Nobody would even deign to mention the people involved in this. Let's say that no country has more messed up the world, and certainly the Middle East, than Britain. Britain already made the problems that we're facing in 1915. Basically, in 3 years, 1915 to 1917, Britain promised 3 times over all of this land. First to the French, second to the Arabs, third to the Jews. This is in the Balfour Declaration. So this is this is British imperial manipulations that now have a shadow and a legacy of more than 100 years of chaos. The French, without a principle, okay? The French are always a little bit second fiddle to the British, but they wanted their little imperial peace as well, and they got it in Lebanon, they have it in Syria, and what good has come out of any of this? Not at all. Britain will never get this right. The nostalgia for empire, the bravado, the arrogance, it's, by the way, remarkably undiminished. 80 years after the end of the empire, Keith Starmer, they all do. Boris Johnson, they all think they're Lord Palmerston. They're all going off to battle. So Britain, I give no hope for at all in this, because nostalgia seems to have the longest lifespan of all, imperial nostalgia. I have not understood for years continental Europe's European Union approach to any of this. Of course, there are glimmers where there's some insight. The Spanish government has been very good on Palestine. The Irish, absolutely wonderful. They have their own colonial experience. But what you're saying is not good speculation about the future. It is the historical record. What has happened to every intervention? There is ongoing, nonstop war and division. This is true, of course, in Iraq. It's true, obviously, in Lebanon. It is true, obviously, in Syria, where this country has been completely dismantled, broken in every way. It was a functioning middle-income country with normal development prospects before 2011, before the deliberate attempt to destroy it. What has happened in Libya since Gaddafi was brought down? Did that bring peace and democracy, as these fools in my government pretend it will? No, of course not. It has brought nonstop civil war. Somalia, it doesn't exist as a functioning country to this day. Sudan, absolutely astounding. There are millions of people on the brink of starvation. There is a war inside Sudan, a civil war, and there's a civil war in South Sudan. In other words, what has happened from this 7 wars in 5 years strategy of Netanyahu and the Israel lobby? Yes, they've remade the Middle East into a catastrophe, into an ongoing, fulminant war zone. And Netanyahu's most fervent hope till this day is war with Iran. And of course, it's not an irony, it's the tragedy of all of this. Iran has been indicating, I can't wait to see it go, for 2 years, peace offerings, saying we want to negotiate, we want to find a diplomatic resolution. I spoke with another intermediary yesterday who asked not to be identified, who was involved in high-level discussions where Iran was trying to reach out to find a diplomatic approach.
Freddie, why should the neighboring states pay for what Israel and the United States did in Gaza?
Because as a realist, you should accept that it's in their regional interest.
It's not in their regional interest at all.
Why not?
The United States and Israel destroyed Gaza. The Israelis were executing a genocide. I mean, Trump sits there with Netanyahu and they talk about Gaza now being unlivable, and they talk about all the destruction in Gaza and the fact that the Palestinians cannot live there. It has been so thoroughly wrecked. And then the question is, who wrecked Gaza? Who did this?
Hello and welcome to the Americano Show. Today I am delighted to be joined by a favourite guest of our show, and that's Professor John Mearsheimer, who is a professor and international relations scholar at the University of Chicago. And we're going to be asking if Donald Trump's foreign policy makes any sense. Because, as you would have noticed, over the last 3 weeks, there has been a blizzard of foreign policy news coming out of the White House, major developments, seemingly major developments, so much so that it's been quite hard to concentrate on what is going on for journalists, let alone people who aren't paid to follow this for a living. John, I'll start by asking you, what are your sort of broad brush impressions of Trump's foreign policy in his second term? Has it differed in any way to what you expected?
I think that basically what Trump is trying to do at this point in time is to sort of create chaos on all fronts, make a number of wild assertions, put forward policy ideas that are never going to be realized. And I think the hope on his part is that out of all this chaos that he's creating, he can come up with some sort of formidable grand strategy that solves all the big problems that the United States and the West faces, and in the end, fashion a coherent grand strategy that deals with these different problems. But at this point in time, what we really have is him making a lot of, I think it's fair to say, wild and crazy statements. I mean, the idea that Canada is going to become the 51st state, that we're going to take back the Panama Canal, that we're going to grab Greenland, that the United States is going to go into Gaza and ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and then turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. Well, all these ideas are basically outlandish. And you would not expect, a new president to start off by making a whole set of comments like that. And at the same time, and we can talk more about this, I don't think he's done much of anything to fix the Middle East problem, and this is mainly the Gaza problem at this point in time, or the Ukraine problem. You want to remember, he said that he was going to come in and solve the Ukraine problem in one day, and that maybe even solve it before he moved into the White House. We can talk about this again, but if anything, it looks to me like we're in more trouble on Ukraine than we were before he became the president. So I'm not too sure how this all works out in the end. He may have a grand strategy in mind that escapes me, and we may live happily ever after. But at this point in time, it sure doesn't look that way.
Can I try and put a small point in Trump's defense? When you say he's proposing ethnically cleansing Palestinians, has he actually done that?
Has he done that?
Yeah.
No, and he's not going to be able to do it. That's my point.
No, but has he proposed that?
Yes, he's talked about pushing the Palestinians, all of the Palestinians. By my count, there were before this conflict started on October 7th, there were about 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. And he's talking about clearing them all out. And that would have to be done at the end of a rifle barrel. Those people are not going to leave. He has not said that he was going to push them out at the end of a rifle barrel, but that is implicit in what he says. But he's committed to getting rid of those people, and he's now said that they're not welcome back. In the beginning, when he first raised this idea, he talked about pushing them out maybe temporarily. But now that's been taken off the table, and the idea is that they're going to be pushed out permanently, and he's going to find new homes for them in places like Jordan and Egypt.
Well, I want to get onto Gaza a bit more later, but if we could stick for now with the broad brush points. You're a realist. You are probably the world's leading expert on realism in international relations. Does it not strike you that perhaps Trump is a much more realist foreign policy president than his predecessors? He is asserting, or trying to assert, control over the Western Hemisphere in a more direct and open way than others. And he is transactional and pragmatic in his approach to Ukraine and the Middle East. His tariffs are direct and strike me as faintly realistic in some ways. Certainly not in terms of the economics, but in terms of the hard power dynamics. What do you make of what I'm saying?
I think there's no question, Freddie, that he definitely has realist instincts. You want to remember that when he became president in 2017, he immediately abandoned engagement with China and switched to a containment policy. And indeed, he campaigned on abandoning engagement and moving toward containment in 2016. And I believe that's a very realist policy. He's also made the argument that all these terrible forever wars should have never happened, and that he was going to end them, and that he was not going to engage in any more forever wars. Given those policy positions, I applaud him. I think he was on the money. But what we're talking about now is how he is acting since he moved into the White House on January 20th. You know, what exactly is his grand strategy? And I think that at this point in time, it looks like it's hard to say exactly how he's going to pursue those broad realist goals. And I think, if anything, it looks remarkably chaotic. If you made me president of the United States, and we don't have to worry about that ever happening, I would not have come into office and started talking about, you know, annexing Canada, taking back the Panama Canal, and so forth and so on. I would have put all my attention on trying to shut down the Gaza conflict once and for all, and also trying to shut down the Ukraine conflict once and for all. Those should be the highest priority issues. And I don't think that he has paid much attention to Ukraine. And with regard to Gaza, I think that his proposal to ethnically cleanse Gaza and turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East is really crazy and is not going to help the situation. So he may have realist instincts. This is your point. And he may be a marked improvement on his predecessor and his predecessors in this regard. I'm not going to argue against that. But in terms of how he's actually performed in the first 3 weeks. And we do want to be aware of the fact that he's only been president for 3 weeks. And that's a very short period of time. So you don't want to pass final judgment. But I would just say, I don't think he's off to a good start.
How much weight do you put on rhetoric or words or messaging when you study things from a realist point of view? I mean, could you not say that what Trump says is less important than what America actually does? And of course, rhetoric and bluster is clearly part of his modus operandi.
Well, I think there's no question that a lot of what he says, everybody recognizes it doesn't mean very much in and of itself. In other words, no, I don't think anybody believes Canada is going to become the 51st state or that we're going to invade Panama anytime soon. So I think there's no question that people understand that a lot of this is just bluster. It's the way Trump operates, and he does it at the domestic level as well as the foreign policy level. But the point I would make to you, Freddie, is I do think words matter. And I think if you look at all the different things that he's been saying to different audiences, it's not clear that this is very helpful. And we don't want to get into the Ukraine case in great detail at this point in time. But if you look at Ukraine, he said a number of things to the Russians that are quite offensive and are not going to engender trust in him among Russian elites, especially Putin. And I think moving forward, if anything, he wants to do everything he can to create a situation where Trump is trusted by Putin. But if you look at what he says and how he says it, I don't think he's helping his cause. Trump is helping his cause. So words do matter, even for realists. And I think in that regard, he's not been terribly smart.
Do you think that the Israelis have a point when they say that Trump is thinking out of the box? This is what Netanyahu says, and that is constructive, because there are no other viable solutions for what to do about Gaza. And when it comes to the Palestinians, attempts to accommodate them, attempts to find some kind of compromise have always failed, going back to 1948.
You're asking me, is there a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's been there and we've just missed? The answer is no. There was no way you were going to solve this one, because the Israelis from the beginning have wanted all of Greater Israel. They were never interested in giving the Palestinians a state of their own. This is a myth that we purvey in the West so that we can support Israel fully. So it's not like I think there is a solution out there, a viable solution. The best that the Israelis were able to come up with was where they basically locked the Palestinians in Gaza in a giant open air prison, and they thought they could manage that problem. And that looked like it worked up until October 7th. And now the question is, what do you do moving forward? And the Israelis would like to cleanse Gaza. That's been their policy goal since October 7th, to cleanse Gaza. They want to get rid of all the Palestinians. And the question is, do you think this is a viable or an ethical solution? I don't think it's a viable solution, because I don't think the Palestinians are going to leave. You want to remember that the Israelis have just spent the past 16 months executing what I call a genocide in Gaza. They have murdered huge numbers of Palestinians. By almost all accounts, they've made the place unlivable. It's really quite remarkable when you see the destruction that they have wrought in Gaza. And nevertheless, the Palestinians are still there, and Hamas, by Israeli accounts and by Tony Blinken's account, is alive and well. So what are we going to do now to fix the problem? What's the viable solution that Trump has? What does this thinking outside of the box add up to? There's no question he's thinking outside of the box, but is what he is thinking logical? Is it viable? Is it morally correct? I don't think it's any of those things. I, as an American, certainly don't want to be associated with a policy that calls for ethnically cleansing Gaza at the end of a rifle barrel. And furthermore, I don't think you can do it. The Israelis were unable to do it. I don't think we're going to be able to do it. Trump has made it clear we're not going to go in there and do it. So who's going to do it? The Israelis? Well, they've already tried. What do you think they've been doing for the past 15 months? This is like, people say if the hostages don't come back on Saturday, these are the Israeli hostages who are due to be released this Saturday. If they don't come back, Netanyahu is going to restart the war. And I say to myself, okay, what does that mean? The war was not going very well, which is why the Israelis agreed to the ceasefire. They didn't agree to the ceasefire because Trump put great pressure on them. They agreed to the ceasefire in large part because the IDF, the Israeli military, put great pressure on Netanyahu to effect a ceasefire because the IDF understood it could not defeat Hamas, number one, and number two, the Israeli army was coming apart at the seams. It was suffering great casualties in Gaza, and furthermore, that this is an army that's configured for fighting short wars, not long wars. It was not configured to fight a war of attrition over a long period of time in Gaza. So it was in deep trouble. So the Israelis agreed to a ceasefire. And now we're talking about putting an end to that ceasefire. Okay, what's the magic formula that the Israelis have now come up with that's going to allow them to deal with the Hamas problem that they couldn't deal with for the first 16 months of the war? I just don't understand. So, Trump is thinking outside the box, but sometimes thinking outside the box makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And in this case, I don't think it makes sense.
I want to go back a little bit to where you said that the Israelis have always wanted a greater Israel. Isn't that a pretty controversial thing to say and perhaps unfair, given that there may be politicians in Israel today who wanted greater Israel and have done for a long time, but Israel as a state has not always acted as though it has wanted a greater Israel. It has sought accommodation with the Palestinians and it has been rebuffed.
No, I don't believe that. I believe these are myths that we tell ourselves in the West so that we can continue to support Israel down the line. I think the original Zionists, the people who were interested in creating a Jewish state, which of course happened in May of 1948, understood full well that they could not take all the territory at once, simply because there were so many Palestinians in the area and not nearly as many Jews, and it would have to be done incrementally. But the idea that the Israelis were interested in a meaningful two-state solution, and it was the Palestinians who rejected those wholly generous offers by the Israelis, is a tall tale. And I know we tell it in the West, and when I make the argument that I'm making, people think that, I'm an anti-Semite or I'm hostile to Israel and so forth and so on. But there's a whole literature written by Israelis that makes it clear that the Israelis were never interested in creating a Palestinian state, and they wanted all of Israel. They just understood that they'd have to do it gradually. They wouldn't be able to take all that territory all at once.
Yeah, well, I would never accuse you of anti-Semitism, although I know a lot of people do. But let's get back to Trump rather than getting into a discussion of Middle Eastern politics, because what a lot of people are speculating, and this certainly looks like it might be playing out now, is that what Trump was trying to do was pressure the neighboring Arab states to come up with viable solutions of their own, possibly rebuilding Gaza themselves, paying for it, and possibly trying to look after some of the Palestinian people who have been displaced. Jordan seems to be rebuffing Trump a bit more forcefully at the moment, whereas Egypt has suggested that it would like to come up with a reconstruction plan for Gaza. So perhaps this is bluster from Trump that is working, that's achieving leverage over those Arab states.
I don't believe that at all. It's actually united the Arab states in the region. universal agreement among the Arab states and universal agreement in the Arab and Islamic world that this is morally reprehensible, that this is the Palestinians' land, that the United States and Israel have absolutely no right to push them out. And in no way are they going to accommodate the United States and Israel. We're isolated on this one. I'm sure the Europeans are with us on this for the most part. But outside of the Europeans, there's no support for what the United States wants to do in this case. The last thing Jordan wants is to create a huge enclave for more Palestinians inside its borders. And Egypt is thinking the same way. Look, the fact is the United States is remarkably powerful. And it has tremendous leverage over Egypt and Jordan, because in the past, we worked out a deal with Egypt and Jordan where we would give them huge amounts of financial aid if they played nice with Israel. We bought off for Israel. We did this for Israel. We bought off Jordan and Egypt. Again, there's a huge literature on this. This is not something I'm making up. But once we do that, not only do we guarantee at the time that Egypt and Jordan will play nice with Israel, but it gives us huge leverage over time. And Trump fully understands that. And he's basically telling the Jordanians and the Egyptians, we have huge economic leverage over you. And we're going to use that leverage to force you. We're going to coerce you into accepting the Palestinians. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not the Jordanians and the Egyptians will cave. And the Jordanians made it clear yesterday. The Jordanian president made it clear in a tweet after his meeting with Trump that that's not going to happen. And Sisi, General Sisi, the Egyptian leader, canceled his trip to Washington because he doesn't want to be humiliated by Trump. And he wants to make it clear that he's not going to go along either. So you have a situation here, Freddie. The Palestinians are not going to leave. The Egyptians are not going to take them. The Jordanians are not going to take them. And then you have to ask yourself a simple question. Where does that leave us?
Well, I would say, I'd go back to that point that the Egyptians are saying that they're going to propose a redevelopment plan for Gaza. And to some extent, Trump's move has exposed a certain hypocrisy among the Arab states, which is that there is an astronomical bill to fix Gaza, which neighboring states are not willing to pay. And yet they are willing to condemn Israel, to condemn the United States. They're not willing to take part in any solutions. Trump is pushing them into coming up with solutions.
Freddie, why should the neighboring states pay for what Israel and the United States did in Gaza?
Because as a realist, you should accept that it's in their regional interest.
It's not in their regional interest at all.
Why not?
The United States and Israel destroyed Gaza. The Israelis were executing a genocide. Trump sits there with Netanyahu and they talk about Gaza now being unlivable. And they talk about all the destruction in Gaza and the fact that the Palestinians cannot live there. It has been so thoroughly wrecked. And then the question is, who wrecked Gaza? Who did this? And the answer is the Israelis, Benjamin Netanyahu sitting right next to Trump. And Netanyahu did it in cahoots with Joe Biden and the West, and especially the United States. We should pay for rebuilding Gaza. The Israelis should pay for rebuilding Gaza. It's the Israelis and the Americans who destroyed Gaza, not the Egyptians or the Jordanians.
If you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you'll get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, speaking of the United States paying for rebuilding Gaza, that is what Trump is proposing. So if we take his proposal at face value, a lot of people who support Trump, or a lot of people who voted for Trump, I'd say, did not imagine that occupying Gaza, which is what he's proposing, he said it repeatedly now, would be part of the foreign policy agenda. And in fact, it goes against what he's appeared to stand for, and appeared to stand for in both elections, in all three elections, presidential elections that he's fought, which is America first, and not getting entangled in the Middle East, or further entangled in the Middle East. This would be a huge entanglement, would it not?
Yeah, I've seen a number of tweets from people who identify with the MAGA agenda, protesting what Trump is doing, saying, what is he doing here? My response to that is Trump's proposal on Gaza is not a serious proposal. The United States is not going to ethnically cleanse Gaza and then turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East. This is about as likely as Canada becoming the 51st state. Trump likes to bluster. He likes to make all of these outrageous statements, and then everybody pays huge amounts of attention to these statements, and they never add up to much. You remember when he fell in love with the North Koreans, and he was going to solve that problem, get rid of North Korean nuclear weapons. How well did that work out? The answer is not very well at all. And this one's not going to work out very well either. This is a giant problem. And by the way, Freddie, Trump played an important role in fashioning the ceasefire that took place on January 19th. This is the Gaza ceasefire that took place on January 19th, which of course is the day before he moved into the White House. He sent his mediator, his Middle East mediator, Steve Witkoff, to the Middle East to basically tell Netanyahu, let's get a ceasefire. So it looked like Trump was off to a good start, right? We got a ceasefire in Gaza. And most people, not Netanyahu and company, but most people thought that was all for the good. But since he moved into the White House on January 20th, he's cut in the other direction. And if anything, he's done all he can to undermine the ceasefire agreement. And in my opinion, that doesn't make sense from his point of view, because a ceasefire and trying to work out some sort of meaningful modus vivendi with Israel and the Palestinians is a much smarter thing to do than try to turn Gaza into the Riviera in the Middle East.
Do you think, though, it does make sense from Trump's point of view that perhaps he knew that he had angered the Israelis, he'd angered Netanyahu, and that even perhaps beforehand he'd agreed with Netanyahu that he would change his position later? He angered them in the ceasefire, and he changed his position later to be more accommodating to Israel once he was in power, having achieved this ceasefire on the eve of his inauguration.
Yeah, I think that's a very smart observation, and I think you're probably right. But is there any hard evidence to support it? No, we don't know. And as you know, Trump is somebody who says one thing 1 minute and then says the exact opposite a minute later. So it's hard to tell exactly what's going on. I mean, as I said at the top of the show, I do think that Trump is into sowing chaos, and he operates on the assumption that if you sow chaos, that this will help him, to develop a solution to the various problems, or develop solutions to the various problems that the United States faces around the world. And maybe that's what's going on here. Maybe he's just bent on, saying different things on different days. I would note, though, Freddie, just very quickly, that to contradict myself, at first it looked like when he was talking about turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, that he was just posturing and this was not serious. But it now looks like he really believes that he thinks that this is a meaningful policy position to hold, and that he, for the time being, is going to stick to it. I don't know how long he'll stick to it, because it ought to be quite apparent to him that he's not getting a lot of support in the Arab world, and that Hamas is not going to give up easily in Gaza, and he's going to have to force them out, the Palestinians, if he wants to put this grand plan of his into operation.
Isn't the real politique, if I can say that, here all about Iran, and that Witkoff, Trump, and Netanyahu, they are aligned to an extent on what they want to do about Iran, and that just an hour before Trump's press office released a statement about the plan to take over Gaza, they released the agreement that Netanyahu and Trump seem to have reached on applying maximum pressure on Iran, on effectively pushing the Iranian regime as hard as they can.
No, I disagree with that. In fact, Haaretz had a headline story yesterday that made the point that what happened in Netanyahu's visit to the United States with regard to the Iranian issue was terrible news for Netanyahu. Netanyahu is not interested in maximum pressure. We've tried maximum pressure before. You want to remember that President Trump, in his first term, walked away from the nuclear arms agreement that the West and the Russians and the Chinese had fashioned with Iran. This is the famous JCPOA. That was the nuclear agreement. In 2018, Trump walked away from that, and Trump said that we're going to instead pursue a policy of maximum pressure to force Iran to agree to a better deal. Well, that failed. And what he's doing now is he is telling the Israelis, he's telling Netanyahu something he doesn't want to hear, which is that the United States is not planning on using military force to attack Iran. That's what Netanyahu wants. He wants the United States and Israel operating as a tag team to go in and blast the nuclear facilities in Iran. Trump has made it clear he has no interest in doing that, and instead he's going back to maximum pressure. The Israelis, of course, had to agree in public with Trump's policy position, but behind closed doors, they're adamantly opposed to it, which is why Haaretz had this headline yesterday saying that Netanyahu's position on Iran was undermined during his visit to Washington.
I take that point, but I suppose what I was getting at was the first Trump administration made some strides. It wasn't all just bluster and bluff in the Middle East. They did make some strides towards achieving the Abraham Accords, better negotiations between Arab states and Israel. And of course, the final piece of that puzzle, not the final piece, but a very important piece of that puzzle, will be an accord between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And that by applying maximum pressure on Iran, perhaps not going as far as Netanyahu wants, but they are pushing ahead with the process that they started in their first term.
I'm not sure what you're saying here. First of all, with regard to Iran, Iran is now enriching uranium up to 60% as a result of walking away from the JCPOA, as a result of Trump's policy, which was enthusiastically backed by Benjamin Netanyahu. We're now in a situation where Iran is about 2 weeks away from where it could enrich enough uranium for 4 or 5 bombs. 2 weeks away. To go from 60% enrichment to 90% enrichment is easy. That is saying that we are in much worse shape today with regard to a nuclear Iran than we were in 2018 when Trump walked away from the JCPOA. With regard to the Abraham Accords, I don't think the Abraham Accords matter for very much anyway. So there are these 4 Abraham Accords. What do they have to do with solving the Palestinian problem? What do they have to do with solving the Hezbollah problem? What do they have to do with solving the Syrian problem? What do they have to do with solving the Iranian problem? The answer is virtually nothing. So you have good relations between the UAE and Israel. You have good relations between Sudan and Morocco and Israel. Does this really matter? Were those countries at war and all of a sudden those wars were shut down by the Abraham Accords? I think not. And with regard to Saudi Arabia, if you read what the Saudis are now saying about Trump's plan to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, it's quite clear that we're further than ever from having an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia. Now, in the West, people like to talk about the fact that Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia is just around the corner. I would argue that if you look carefully at the evidence, that's not true at all. But even if you get an Abraham Accord with Saudi Arabia, what's the big deal? Is that going to help with all these different problems in places like Gaza, the West Bank, Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran? I think the answer is no.
Well, you said earlier that words matter. I would have thought accords matter, and diplomatic relations between countries being good matters because it's better than being bad.
The question, Freddie, is how much does it matter? And the answer is it doesn't matter very much at all. It matters for Saudi Arabia and Israel, but Saudi Arabia is not the big problem in the Middle East. We don't talk about the Saudi versus Israel conflict, right? Or the Sudan versus Israel conflict. We talk about places like Gaza, the West Bank, the Palestinians, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria. And these accords have little to do with those conflicts.
As we understand it, President Trump is quite concerned, or the people around him are quite concerned about an apparent Iranian threat to assassinate him. He said the other day that he's left instructions that if he is assassinated by Iran, there will be all hell to pay, or words to that effect. I mean, I think Trump might be more willing to nuke Tehran than you're willing to grant.
Well, he has made it very clear that he does not want to, quote him, bomb the hell out of Iran. You want to remember that he was elected in 2016 and he was elected again in 2024 on the platform that he was not going to start any more wars. That's the realist in Trump, and I think that's all for the good. I think there's no question if it was clear that Iran assassinated President Trump, and let's hope that never happens. Let's hope he's never assassinated, period. But if there was clear evidence that Iran assassinated Trump as president, there's no question whether Trump left orders or not that his successor would make Iran pay a god-awful price. There's just no question about that. But there's no evidence that Iran is trying to assassinate Trump that I know of. If there's evidence, they can show it to me, and then I'll believe it. But I don't think that Iran would be crazy enough to assassinate Trump. They surely can figure out what the consequences would be for them, and they would not be good. And therefore, I don't think they're out to assassinate Trump. So I think this is much to do about nothing.
There are some people who think, contrary to what I've been saying before, that Trump's agenda is to actually, go to Tehran at some point to surprise everyone by fashioning some kind of agreement with Iran, as he did with Kim Jong-un and North Korea in his first term, and perhaps as Nixon did with China. He sees himself as somebody who's capable of breaking these surprising alliances.
Well, the problem that he would face if he did that, Freddie, is he'd run into the Israel lobby. The Israel lobby is deeply committed to making sure that the United States and Iran remain mortal enemies, at least as long as Iran has the capability to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium. And therefore, I think if Trump began to play nice with Iran, the Israel lobby would move in and make it very clear to him that that's unacceptable, and he would change his behavior.
For viewers who have not read your work on the Israel lobby, what exactly is the Israel lobby?
Well, it's a group of individuals and organizations in the United States that are profoundly committed to making sure that the United States supports Israel unconditionally. It's very important to understand that the United States has a relationship with Israel that has no parallel in recorded history. The United States and Israel, despite the fact they sometimes have different interests, this is not to deny that they sometimes have the same interest. but they often have different interests. And in those cases, the lobby works overtime to make sure that the United States supports Israel unconditionally. And that's what the special relationship is all about. And the lobby is, I believe, the most powerful lobby or interest group in the history of the United States. And it wields enormous influence. And if any president pursues a policy in the Middle East that the Israelis adamantly oppose, you can rest assured that the lobby will go to work on Israel's behalf and push that American leader to support Israel. So on the Iran issue, Bill Clinton, when he was president, he started to play nice with the Israelis. And the lobby quickly moved in and told him the basic facts of life, which is he's not allowed to play nice with the Iranians because the Israeli government considers that unacceptable. I laid this out, Steve Walton and I laid this out in our chapter on Iran in the book on the Israel lobby.
Well, let's talk about whether there's a Ukraine lobby in Washington and what they might be thinking about Trump's latest moves. Scott Bessent is, I think, in Kiev at the moment, talking to Ukraine. There seems to be some kind of deal on the cards, which is that the US, in return for continuing to support Ukraine, will get more obvious access to Ukrainian minerals. And I wonder what you think about that, because to some extent that's a bit like what we were talking about early on, which is that Trump's much more transactional, much more nakedly selfish, if you like, or certainly national interest driven foreign policy is at least more direct and clear than the Biden administration's policy, which was to sort of sotto voce talk about Ukraine's minerals and how important they could be, but publicly to talk about democracy and the importance of defending it and so on.
Look, if you're a good realist, Freddie, you defend a country like Ukraine because you think it's in the American national interest. And basically what Trump is saying is that if you don't pay us back for what he claims is the $300 billion that we've given you to fight this war, if you don't pay us back with this mineral wealth, we're going to cut off our assistance to you. This is what you call transactional. This is completely at odds with basic realist logic. I mean, it looks like we're in this to make money. And it's no accident that the German chancellor condemned Trump for making this claim or making this line of argument. It makes us look like we're mercenaries. Just a fundamental mistake, and it's completely at odds with realism. Trump told us that he was going to settle the Ukrainian conflict in one day. And there is no evidence that we are even close to settling the Ukraine conflict. And if anything, we're heading in the other direction. So he has failed so far. Now, of course, he's only been in office for 3 weeks, but there is no evidence that he has a plan for shutting this war down. And it looks like the war is going to go on. And it looks like he is doing everything he can to dump this war into the lap of the Europeans. And it looks like the Europeans are coming to recognize that they don't have any choice but to accept much more of the burden of dealing with this war. So this is bad news all around. Bad news for the Ukrainian people, bad news for the Russians, bad news for the United States, bad news for the West, because we're not going to shut this one down anytime soon.
If it isn't realism, what is it? Is it mercantilism? Is it, I've seen people calling it national capitalism. Is it something new entirely?
I don't know. It's just, Trump sowing chaos. It's hard to say. As I've said, a few times here, I'm not exactly sure what Trump is up to. It doesn't make sense to me to say, after all of the attention the United States has paid to the Ukraine war, after all the support that the United States has given to Ukraine, to all of a sudden turn around and say, if you don't give us a huge chunk of your mineral wealth, we're going to abandon you. But if you don't, right, if you do give us all of this mineral wealth, we won't abandon you. We'll continue to support the war. That's what he's saying. That's certainly not a realist perspective, certainly not a morally correct perspective. And it raises the question, what is he doing here? You know, why do this? And I don't have a good answer.
Well, I mean, it might be answered by looking at his relationship to Russia, or his approach to Russia, his approach to Putin and the Kremlin. He has appeared to be a realist when it comes to Russia's interests, or understanding Russia's interests in the past. Russia in recent days has released an American hostage. I think it's going to, a prisoner, I should say. I think it's going to release another. Something's going on there, is it not? What can we interpret about that?
What's going on? I mean, I want to know what the plan is. The Russians have made it very clear what they want. And the question is, what is Trump willing to do to accommodate the Russians? What's the plan? There's no evidence they have a plan. There's no evidence there are any meaningful contacts between the Russians and the Americans for purposes of shutting this war down. So I don't think that releasing some prisoner makes any difference at all. The question is, what is the deal? What does Trump think he can do to shut this war down? And there's no evidence that the administration has the foggiest idea how they can shut this war down. And instead, Trump has been saying outrageous things about the Russians that are, if anything, designed to erode trust between the Russians and the Americans. And there's not very much trust to begin with. But, you know, he says that the Russians have suffered 1 million deaths, which is a ludicrous claim, that their economy is in shambles, which is another ludicrous claim. And he says that he's going to do Putin a favor by shutting this war down for him, that we're going to do Putin a favor. Do you think this is going to make Putin think that Trump is somebody he can trust? Of course not. And Putin doesn't trust the West much at all. And Trump is just making the problem worse. So there's no concrete proposal floating around. There are no viable ideas coming out of the administration on how to accommodate the Russians, who happen to be in the driver's seat on the battlefield. And instead, what you're getting are rather outlandish statements that, if anything, going to make it harder to get a deal rather than easier.
Well, lastly, John, because I know I'm taking up a lot of your time here, but I would like to ask you a bit about China, which we talked a little bit about at the beginning. You did. Anyway, is that I'd like to put it to you that the real strategic focus of the Trump administration, as we understand it so far, and even more so in this second term, it seems, is dealing with China, dealing with the rise of China, confronting the rise of China. And he has people like Elbridge Colby in his administration who are very concerned about that. And that, you know, when you look at the Panama Canal, what he's talking about in the Panama Canal, that's very much a concern about China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has now, the Panamanian leader has said he will get rid of the Belt and Road, I believe. If you look at Greenland, that's long been a strategic concern that China is, could break through in the Arctic Circle and so on. The real focus is China. And if we want to make any sense of Trump's foreign policy, we need to think about what it's thinking about China.
I mean, I think that there's no question that the United States should be riveted on China, and it should think about how best to smartly contain China. I think that being pinned down in the Middle East and being pinned down in Ukraine makes it difficult for the United States to focus its attention on dealing with China. And therefore, one hoped that Trump would come in and shut down the conflict in Gaza, shut down the conflict in Ukraine, and concentrate on fashioning a smart containment policy in East Asia. That has not happened. As I said, he is, if anything, making the situation in Gaza worse and not doing much at all to get us out of the Middle East. And there's no evidence that he's going to put an end to the Ukraine war. So we're pinned down in these two places, which causes us all sorts of problems in East Asia. Furthermore, if you look at what's happened in East Asia since he's taken office, there are all sorts of articles beginning to appear that because of what he's done with USAID, our position in Southeast Asia, where we have long had problems fashioning alliances that can help us contain China, our situation there in Southeast Asia is getting worse. And given Trump's tendency to slap allies around, it's not clear to me that he's going to do a really good job fashioning a balancing coalition in East Asia against China. So I think the situation in East Asia is actually not looking good at all.
And actually, this time, lastly, I know I said lastly last time, but I would like to ask you by answering a sort of yes/no question. You don't have to answer at length if you don't want to. A lot of people talk about the Trump administration as reversing America's decline as a superpower. It sounds to me from what you're saying that you believe he could be accelerating its decline. Do you believe he's accelerating it or reversing it or checking it in some way?
Well, when I think about decline, Freddie, I think of it in terms of the balance of power. I think about how powerful the United States is in material terms versus how powerful China and Russia are relative to the United States. And the reason that the United States has been declining in terms of its power over time is because China has been rising. So it's in terms of relative power that we have been declining. But in terms of absolute power, if you look at the state of the American economy is doing quite well. It's growing. And I believe that if you look at the future, right, there's every reason to think that the US economy will do very well. But the question is, how well will the Chinese economy continue to do? And if the Chinese economy were to grow at a really significant rate in the years ahead, then there would be relative decline for the United States, because relative to China, we would be declining, even though our economy would be growing every year. So I think American decline mainly has to do with the Chinese economy. Now, to take this a step further, and I think this is a very important point, when we talk about containing China and we talk about dealing with China from an American point of view, the focus is usually on containment and putting together a balancing coalition, which involves usually a focus on military force. But there's another competition that's taking place, and that has to do with cutting edge technologies, things like AI, quantum computing, super chips, and so forth and so on. And there is a wickedly intense competition taking place there. And that competition for high-end technologies matters enormously for the balance of economic power, which, of course, for a good realist like me, is of great consequence. So I think moving forward, the key question is, how well does China do with AI, for example, versus how well the United States does with AI, right? And this will tell you a great deal about American decline moving forward. Now, all of this is to say, just to go to the heart of your point or your question, I don't think that Trump is doing anything yet that is eroding America's absolute power, right? Or speeding up America's relative decline. What Trump is having great trouble with so far, and again, he's only been 3 weeks into his administration, is the diplomacy that comes along with military power. The United States has this enormous power. It's still the most powerful state on the planet. The question is, what does American diplomacy look like? How is America using all that power that it has to fashion or to influence events around the world that are in the American national interest? And that's where I have all sorts of doubts about what Trump is doing. And of course, I had all sorts of doubts about what Biden was doing before Trump. So I think that in terms of power, the United States is not in bad shape. I think it's in terms of how it uses that power that it gets itself into trouble. And that's what worries me about Trump.
Professor John Mearsheimer, thank you very much for coming on to Americano. It's always a great pleasure to have you on.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermin Sheikh.
To talk more about Trump's call for the United States to seize Gaza and force out the entire Palestinian population, we're joined here in New York by Peter Beinart, editor-at-large of Jewish Currents and professor of journalism and political science at City University of New York. He's the author of the new book just out titled Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. Welcome back to the program, Peter, and congratulations on your book, which we'll turn to in a moment. But if we could first get you to respond to the remarks that Trump made a couple of days ago, astonishing remarks about basically the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, turning it into the Riviera of the Middle East, and so on. If you could respond.
I mean, what we're seeing really is, at a macro level, is the question of whether you can do in the 21st century what you could do in the 19th century, which is to basically destroy entire populations of people because you view them as subhuman. Donald Trump views Palestinians as subhuman, and therefore wants to oversee a mass ethnic cleansing, which would be one of the greatest crimes of this century. And all across Washington, you hear people essentially shrug, or people say maybe it's impractical. I don't care. The question is not whether it's impractical. The question is whether we should be thinking about how we get Donald Trump in front of the International Criminal Court as a war criminal. This is one of the most monstrous things an American president has said in our time. And the fact that it can be assimilated like this is just testament to the profound dehumanization of Palestinians that suffuses American public discourse.
I have a question for you. Diana Buttu, the well-known Palestinian attorney, when asked about this, hours after President Trump made this announcement, talking about the demolition site that is Gaza, she said she agreed it's a demolition site. And about moving Palestinians, she said, well, the first point would be moving them back to their homes. Can you give us the history that even you really had no sense of until you began to really study what was going on outside your Jewish education?
Sure. I was raised in a family where Israel was central and where we thought about Israel in terms of what it meant for Jewish safety, a state for Jews where Jews could be safe after the Holocaust. And that was a source of great psychological security, especially for my grandmother, for older people in my generation who themselves had experienced a lot of trauma in their lives. I'm embarrassed to say it was really not until my 30s, when I went to spend time with Palestinians in the West Bank, that I began to really face what Israel and Zionism had meant for Palestinians. And you're exactly right. Every American media discussion of Gaza should start with the fact that people in Gaza, most of them are not from Gaza. They are people who are from families that were forcibly expelled from what is now Israel. Many of them can see the lands from which their parents and grandparents were expelled from Gaza. They can see these fertile, relatively uncrowded territories while they live crowded into a ghetto half the size of New York City that the UN called unlivable for human beings before October 7th. And so, yes, if Gaza is unlivable because Israel and the United States have made it catastrophically unlivable, then people should be allowed to return to the places from which, not to expel Israeli Jews, but to live in equality alongside Israeli Jews, a principle that is considered unfathomable in Israel-Palestine, even though it's the principle that we supposedly believe in the United States.
So with those remarks, Peter, let's just get to your book. If you could just begin, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. Explain why you wrote this book and to whom the book is addressed.
The book is addressed to my fellow Jews and trying to say that something has gone catastrophically wrong in our community when an Israeli government that claims to speak for the Jewish people and American Jewish leaders can watch a Jewish state with American weapons destroy most of the buildings, most of the hospitals, most of the schools, most of the agriculture, leave an unprecedented number of child amputees in Gaza, and then justify this with the flimsiest of possible justifications, as I go through in my book. Jewish tradition, as I understand it, believes in the infinite dignity of every human being. That is, we say every life is a universe. How is it that people that our tradition, which speaks that way, and yet our leadership today acts in such a way that is radically contrary to that principle?
Well, one of the things that you say is early on in the book, you talk about the secularization of Judaism, which in certain instances, as you say, has led to a kind of moral evasion. Of course, one should say that that's not only true of Judaism, but arguably of other Abrahamic faiths as well. You say, quote, in the absence of a belief in divine reward and punishment, we no longer wrestle in the same way with what our sacred texts say about Jewish ethical responsibility. If you could elaborate on that.
I think what's happened in Jewish communities in the U.S. around the world is that a religion, a vast religion that speaks in many, many different voices, but emphasizes the dignity of all human beings, has been swallowed by ethno-nationalism. In many Jewish communities in the United States today, you get in more trouble for challenging the legitimacy of the State of Israel than for questioning the authority of the Torah, right? The social penalties for being a critic of Israel are much greater than the social penalties for violating Shabbat or keeping kosher, which are foundational principles in Jewish faith. I think something similar in some ways is happening among many white Christians. In the era of Donald Trump, these people seem to think that if you don't have an American passport, you are worthless. It's as if that Christianity's universal message has been swallowed by the ethno-nationalism of America first. And in a way, when you see Jewish discourse about Israel, you see something similar. The state is sacred, and what our tradition says about human beings is ultimately devalued.
You write in your book, Peter, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, about the anguish of Palestinians. You say, this book is about the story Jews tell ourselves to block out the screams. So go back in history and talk to us about what Jews understand, Israelis understand, and what the standard education is and how you re-educated yourself. For example, right now, what's being talked about is this forcing out of the Palestinian population. It's not the first time. It's not even the second time. Talk about the exoduses.
Right. This is in Israel's political DNA. Israel was created with an act of mass expulsion of Palestinians. That's why those people are in Gaza in the first place. There was another act of mass expulsion in 1967, and there have been smaller expulsions since then, ongoing. Right? And so this is something that is inherent in the notion. If the notion of your state is that the state has to have a large Jewish majority, that Jews have to rule, then Palestinians constitute a demographic problem, right? And so it's not really surprising at all that people on the Israeli right want to solve that demographic problem by getting rid of Palestinians. That's how Israel was created in the first place. Explain what happened then in 1948. Explain what happened to the Palestinian villages. They were completely demolished. What happened was that David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, said, this cannot be a truly Jewish state unless it has a roughly 80% Jewish majority, which was actually the state that Israel would have been given under the UN was far, far less than that. So you had to have carry out mass ethnic cleansing. In Jewish communities, people tend to say this only began when the Arab countries invaded in May 1948. It's not true. Haifa and Jaffa, for instance, the largest Palestinian populations, were ethnically cleansed before May 1948 because it was impossible to create a Jewish state. There were simply too many Palestinians there, so you had to clear them off in order to create a large Jewish majority where Jews controlled the land. That's how Israel was created. And it's the refusal in Israel and in organized American Jewish communities and in Washington to honestly discuss that history that brings us to this point where we have an American president who wants to replay that history.
And so if you could say, Peter, you speak at some length in the book about the responses to October 7th in the Jewish communities, and in the U.S., I would say, in some ways generally, the kinds of analogies that were drawn to October 7th, the images that were invoked by October 7th. And you are critical of some of those images. If you could elaborate on what the analogies are and what you think the better analogy, which you enumerate in the book, the better analogies are for what happened on October 7th.
Right. So what happened on October 7th was horrifying. It was really, for me, one of the worst days of my life. And I fundamentally oppose any targeting of civilians, no matter what the circumstances are. But if one wants to prevent future October 7th and make both Israeli Jews and Palestinians safer, you have to understand the conditions that existed in Gaza on October 6th, not to justify, but to understand. And instead what happened in the Jewish discourse was this was immediately called a pogrom. It was called the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. The implication was that this is the reenactment of the murderous anti-Semitism in Europe. But it's fundamentally wrong because that anti-Semitism took place in a case in which Jews were legal inferiors. You can't understand pogroms or the Holocaust without understanding the role of Jews as a subjugated people. But in Israel-Palestine, it's Palestinians who are a subjugated people, who live without basic rights, who are being oppressed. October 7th was an inhumane response to that oppression. And if you want to understand it, one should think about other inhumane responses to oppression. Think about in our own country when Native Americans were forced off their land into smaller and smaller ghettos. There were many times in the 19th century where Native Americans broke out of those reservations and killed men, women, and children in pitiless attacks, right? But you had to understand the context of what was happening to them to understand that violence. Instead, what we see, and this is exactly what happened with Native Americans, is they're simply described as barbarians. And when you describe them as barbarians and savages, you justify even more catastrophic violence against them.
Well, and you say, and this was a very interesting interpretation that you gave afterwards, when you explained the correct way to understand this horrific violence of October 7th, you say that pondering these analogies is alien and uncomfortable. The analogy that you just gave, for example, of Native Americans. They alter, you write, they alter the script that explains who we are. And then you point out that earlier generations of Zionists made such comparisons and were, quote, less invested in Jewish innocence. So explain why that is. One would instinctively think the reverse, right? That it was in early Zionism that there was a greater investment in Jewish innocence and arguably a greater case for it.
Right. It's really remarkable now, right? Because today, if you were to call Israel a colonial enterprise, right, you would probably be kicked out of your synagogue. You would be censured by the American Congress, right? You could be penalized at some kind of university. But if you go back and read early Zionist writers, Theodor Herzl, the most important founder of political Zionism, Vladimir Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism, which is Benjamin Netanyahu's own tradition, they use this term frequently and positively to describe what they're doing. Herzl writes to Cecil Rhodes, the arch-imperialist of Southern Africa, and says, we're involved in a common enterprise here, right? Because for them, colonialism meant bringing progress and modernity to a backward part of the world and taking control over it from the populations that were there, because a population from a more advanced civilization could use the territory better, right? That's the real history of Zionism's own. You don't have to read Palestinians. You just have to read early Zionist writers, because there was an honesty there that is not possible today, because now we live in an age where colonialism is a dirty word. It wasn't a dirty word in the early 20th century.
Peter Beinart, how does growing up in South Africa inform your view?
I spent a fair amount of my childhood in a place where white South Africans, including members of my own family, were absolutely convinced that if there was legal equality, if black people got the vote and could form a black government, that their lives would be in mortal danger. It was considered just obvious. And the reason I think this is important is that it is so common in American Jewish and American discourse to assume that if the Palestinians got equality, Jews could never live in Israel and Palestine safely. And the point I try to make in my book is that white South Africans believe the same thing. Protestants in Northern Ireland believe the same thing. Ian Paisley, the Protestant leader, on the eve of the Good Friday Agreement, which gave Catholics political equality, called it prelude to genocide. So many white Southerners and white Americans in general believe that without slavery and segregation, white people would become the slaves, would become the oppressed class. It's not true. It wasn't true. In fact, what we find is that when you give people a voice in government, when they can be represented, that violence goes down because people have a nonviolent path for government to listen to them. That, it seems to me, is the lesson that Jews should try to learn from those experiences.
I mean, just to go back to a point that you made earlier, Peter, about the kind of injunction against saying something against Israel, critical of Israel, versus saying something against Judaism. You also point out in your, or being a Jew, you point out in the book that in Israel itself, there's no religious requirement for election to the Knesset. This is you writing. Of the 14 Israeli PMs, prime ministers, only one, Naftali Bennett, has observed Jewish law. But there is a Zionist requirement. Political parties cannot oppose, quote, the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So if you could talk about what the implications of that are for the potential for a transformation into the kind of context that you've described post-apartheid South Africa.
Yeah, the point I'm trying to make is that both in Israel and the United States, in different ways, the Jewish community is structured to basically make the existence of a Jewish state, a state that privileges Jews over Palestinians, sacred, right? So in Israel, it doesn't matter whether you observe Jewish law. You can be the prime minister, but you can't run for Knesset under Israeli law unless you accept the principle of a state in which Jews rule. In the United States, if you look at Hillel, the organization that works on college campuses, they say very openly to students, we don't care whether you observe any Jewish practice at all, but if you don't support the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, then essentially you're not welcome here, right? To me, this is essentially what happens when you elevate ethno-nationalism, a Jewish state over Judaism itself.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, you in the book you cite Hannah Arendt, who was already warning of the dangers of Jewish nationalism, saying, quote, the greatness of this people, the Jewish people, was once that it believed in God, and now this people believes only in itself.
Yes, and in fact, our own tradition also speaks in this way, right? One of the gravest sins in Judaism is idolatry. Idolatry is the worship of something human-made. A state is human-made, right? Mm-hmm. In Jewish tradition, as I understand it, you start with the sanctity and the dignity of the individual, and that is paramount. And then a state must be evaluated. Its legitimacy is dependent on how it treats the individual. So again and again, we are required to say that we believe Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. No. The children of Gaza have a right to exist. They have a right to live. Their lives are of infinite value. And the question you ask about the structure, the political system of any state is that state guaranteeing that right to life and that right to flourish? And if it's not, if it's failing radically, if it's destroying those lives, then you have to think about reconstituting the state in a more ethical way.
Peter Beinart, leading Jewish organizations like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, the AJC, would never question the findings of international legal organizations like the International Court of Justice or the ICC when it comes to concluding genocide took place in Bosnia, took place in Rwanda. Talk about the view of what's happening today. And I want to fold into that your quoting of the leading Jewish theologian, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said, whenever I open the prayer book, I see before me the images of children burning with napalm.
Right. You know, Heschel is a hero among many American Jews because he brought the message of the prophets to America. When he marched in Selma and when he marched against the Vietnam War, he said, I believe in a tradition that will speak truth to power in the name of the protection of all life. And Heschel knew nothing of Vietnam. This man grew up as a chassid in Poland. He had no connection to those people, and yet he could see their infinite dignity, and he challenged the organized American Jewish community and the American government to stop destroying them. And so what I have asked myself again and again and again, and I'm an observant Jew since October 7th, where is our religious and moral leadership today of rabbis who would get up and say, I can't pray because I am haunted by the sights of the child amputees in Gaza, of the people who are marching, whose homes have been destroyed, who are living in tents, whose tents are now flooded, who can't get hospital care, whose lives are being utterly ravaged. And yet I just see a community that goes about its business and indeed penalizes people who have the audacity to stand in the footsteps of Heschel and raise these moral concerns.
Well, talk about that, Peter. I mean, what has happened? What have you seen happen here in the community? Because you've also said, even as there has been this, very difficult to say anything critical of Israel, that there is a massive generational shift that's occurring, that younger people are much more critical. They are much more, oriented towards the, justice for Palestine. And what effect do you think that's having on the conversation?
Yes, because there has been a deep contradiction at the heart of American Jewish life. We have told our children that our safety and our values lead us to believe in equality under the law, never again for anyone. And also that we have a tradition of fierce and open debate, which we're very proud of. And then we say to those children, except for on the subject of Israel, which, by the way, is the most important subject, right? And children are good at noting the hypocrisy of their parents, right? And challenging the hypocrisy of their parents. And so many of these children, I've met so many of them who say, you are violating the very principles in which I was taught to believe about what it means to be a Jew, and I'm going to live those principles, even if it brings me into conflict with you, even if it brings me into conflict with our community.
And your response to the very serious crackdown on the pro-Palestinian, you could say pro-justice protests across the country, the encampments, both on the students, you're a professor yourself at CUNY Journalism School, the Newmark School of Journalism, and on professors, and ultimately President Trump saying he's going to deport the international students, I think he calls them alien students, who are, quote, Hamas sympathizers, meaning who engaged in pro-Palestinian protest.
Right. Amy, you know this as well as I do. We have a tradition of learning that is sacred in our tradition, which is part of the reason that American Jews have had a particular affinity for these universities. So many American Jewish families have raised ourselves up through these universities and this tradition, and these universities are a core of American liberal democracy. And yet, in order to protect Israel from the criticism that is happening at these universities, because these universities have a lot of young progressive people, including a lot of young progressive Jews. The organized American Jewish community is essentially willing to get in bed with the Trump administration as it tries to crush academic freedom and freedom of speech at America's universities, and it won't stop on the question of Israel and Palestine. We know very well that the restrictions on free speech, that this is going to be a model and a template for when students want to protest about abortion rights and climate change and racial justice, right? And we're crushing these institutions, which American Jews claim to believe in so much, in order to try to protect them from criticism of Israel.
Peter Beinart, we want to thank you for being with us. Editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. His new book is just out, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning.
Attention, Canadians. Do you feel disconnected from our current political system? This could be our last chance to take a real legal stand for our rights. It's time to shift the political power to its rightful owners, the Canadian citizens and Indigenous peoples of Canada. Dive into our history, understand the need for change, and embark on the quest for true democracy. Are you concerned about our nation's commitment to human rights and self-governance? The power shift to freedom aligns with vital treaties and international laws enabling us to claim our rightful place as collective head of state. We advocate legally replacing the crown, King Charles III, and our partocracy system with a true democracy, the peoples as the true collective head of state with veto power over our governance, to ensure your voice counts more than party interests. When our national collective civil and political rights are respected, your influence on policies will be direct and impactful. Join us on this noble struggle to make every Canadian and Indigenous peoples a meaningful participant in our future as collective head of state, which was legally owed and kept from us since the patriation of our Constitution, an official decolonization from the United Kingdom of 1982. It's time to correct the past of our government's lies and omissions to the people of our great country before it is too late. People 15 years old and over can sign our Canadian People's Referendum at canadianreferendum.ca and unite for our rights as the collective head of state in our Constitution. Together, we can be the example in reshaping Canada's future, not just for us, but for all peoples worldwide, once and for all. Are you ready to be part of this transformative movement? Join the Power Shift to Freedom movement by the Canadian People's Union and be part of a bold vision for Canada's future. Visit thecpu.ca for more details. Embrace and face the change required on your part to shape our future.